our hearts because we're concerned about them. You've got the nitty-gritty information. How about sharing a little bit of that with us?
Yeah, what we were doing was to get a first-hand experience of how mentally ill people are being treated in our prison system. First and foremost, there are far too many of them in prison. We should have them out here in the community. These people need to be treated. There need to be more community-based health centers. We need to stop locking so many people up. But when we do send mentally ill people to prison, and I emphasize we're talking about 40% of the people who are in prison have some mental illness, we need to treat them. And what became obvious as we toured Pontiac, Stateville, Logan, and Dixon is we don't. In Illinois, our default is medicate and isolate. We inject people with antipsychotic drugs, throw them into a tiny little dark dungeon, and leave them there 22 to 24 hours a day with no human contact. Your mental health service consists of 30 seconds with a worker who comes by and yells at you through your cell 2 questions. Are you taking psychotropic medication? And are you going to kill yourself today? And then walks off to the next cell.
Is that because of the volume and lack of staffing, or why have we ended up in this state of affairs?
Yes, it's because we have not recognized that, in fact, we are using our prison system as the default mental health system for poor people and poor black people in particular. There just isn't anything else. So when people get picked up, that's where they're taken. They're taken into prison. Yet we run them as security institutions, not as mental health institutions. So we don't have enough people, we don't spend enough money on mental health, and we leave people to rot, and they're going to come back home. 95, 97% of the people in prison are going to come home. They're going to come home broken and damaged if we don't do better.
You know, we had Sheriff Dart sit when we were broadcasting out of the other side, sit here and say pretty much the same thing about the county system, and you know, and of course we all know as city dwellers that folks who are lost and not tend to flock to the city. So we've got a huge percentage in Cook County Jail who are there because they had no way to protect themselves from being thrown in there, basically.
Well, it's not just they don't have a way to protect themselves, and this goes to the other half of our problem. We have criminalized being poor in this society. So we've been working for the last several months with the folks that are camping because they have nowhere else to live under the Wilson Avenue bridges and the Lawrence bridges over at Lakeshore Drive. And the police are now regularly coming by and giving them tickets for sleeping outside, for obstructing the public way, for camping out in the park. So instead of building houses, instead of providing housing for people, we send out the police to deal with the problem.
And how much are those tickets, just by the way?
Well, the tickets can be $300-$400, but they're not going to pay the tickets. It's a waste of resources. We send out 2 police officers, we send out people from the Department of Human Services who are supposed to be providing services to these folks instead of threatening them and telling them they have to take them into tents. So we as a community need to come together and stop that. The easiest way to deal with mentally ill in prison is to get them out of it. The easiest way to reduce our prison population is stop sending poor people there just because they're poor. Monday night at 5:30, we're asking people, there's going to be a march. We are gathering at Wilson and Lakeshore Drive, and we are marching up to our alderman's house, Alderman Kappelman, who lives Kenmore and Lawrence, and we are telling him, you're bringing the police to our houses, we're bringing the people to your house.
Is tonight a sleep out night? I heard something about that.
November 20th.
Yeah. I thought it was tonight, too.
Let me ask, Alan, why do you think there has been this push by the police to ticket the homeless that are sleeping underneath the Lakeshore Drive? I mean, it's been going on a long time, and it is a ward that has a number of homeless people. Is it an issue that the alderman, you think, wants to take on? Is it from him, or is it from the Park District? Any sense of that?
Well, it's both. It's the alderman is definitely driving it. I mean, he very much is responsive to the gentrifiers coming into Uptown. and they don't like the fact that there are people who are sleeping out very visibly in what they call their community. Right. But of course, it's not their community. People who live under the bridge are residents of Uptown just as much as the man who owns a $500,000 condominium is a resident of Uptown. But the alderman only responds to the developer class, not to the people sleeping under the bridges. But frankly, it's a bigger problem. This is not just happening in Uptown. It's happening in other communities throughout the city. And the problem is the city of Chicago has made it clear, as a matter of policy, we are not going to house people that are homeless. And therefore, the default is criminalizing them. The only housing for them is Cook County Jail, ultimately the prison system, and then they end up on my tour of the mentally ill in prison.
You know, I'm just going to bring this to people's attention because it's something I really liked. A fellow, I don't remember his name, but he did a story for the old Heartland Journal on these little houses, little like box houses along Hubbard Street, where homeless people could lock their stuff up and they could be sheltered in the night if they weren't in a city-run place. And they basically, I think it was under Daley, they just kind of wiped those out.
Right. I mean, Salt Lake City, actually, somewhere we don't think of as being the forefront of progressive thinking, decided the way to deal with the homeless problem is build them homes. And it's actually much cheaper than it is dealing with them in the jail and the emergency rooms in the prison system. Just give them these tiny little houses that we see. 200 square feet, 100 square feet. It's a place to sleep inside and get you off the street.
That's what I was going to ask, Alan. I mean, as long as I have been in Rogers Park, Uptown has been a war ground for the mentally ill, the homeless, the underserved, but there were, for a long, long time, a lot of services in Uptown as well, and an alderman who was fine with that.
Right.
Now you've got a new alderman, and so the war heats up again.
Yep.
And you give this example of Salt Lake City. I'm sorry, this may be politically incorrect, but if you've got Mormons who are figuring out how to house the homeless, isn't it time for us to be able to, put our hands across the water in Uptown and go, okay, let's figure it out, instead of saying it's not their neighborhood or our neighborhood, it's all of our neighbor. It's our city. It's our nation and our problem. So what does it take for us to cross the divides and get to, a solution like Salt Lake City? Sorry, Michael. That was your length of a question, I admit.
I'm going to be really brief next time I get a shot. Go ahead, answer that question.
I don't know that it's a question. I mean, the answer is we've got to stop allowing money to control our politics. I mean, that's the bottom line. People have to get out and vote.
All right, I do have, there is a thing in the New York Times today on the Mormons, Kate. It basically, after the Mormons had said to recognize the gay marriages, because it is the law of the land, they also made a move, I believe, from the headline I'm doing this, to exclude gay couples from the church. So check that out. Everyone, I need a fact checker. I need a Pinocchio guy.
Boy, oh boy.
And I'm going to go back.
Thanks for that addition, Michael. That highly researched edition.
I'll look it up on my phone.
No.
You had a question.
Alan
for
Mills
I do have
is
a
here.
question. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your tour of the state's prisons. We know that under Governor Quinn, I think we closed a prison or two.
We did close 2 prisons. We closed the Supermax prison, which was a very
That was a good
thing.
move.
Right.
We also closed the White Correctional Center, which was not such a good move, except that it was falling apart. So that was purely an economic decision. As a result of not closing those prisons, but as a result of the fact that we keep sending more and more people to prison, our prisons are packed.
And what's happening with the budget around this? How is that affecting it?
Well, at the moment, we've stopped all of the new construction we had going. So, for example, at Logan, the women's prison, they recognized that they didn't have enough space to treat mentally ill people. So they began construction of a brand new cell house, as well as repurposing what had been a vacant building into crisis cells and intensive treatment areas. But all of that, except for the very first part, which is underway, stopped because there's no money at all flowing out of Springfield for anything new to start. So we have a half torn down living unit At Logan Correctional Center.
You didn't
What
mention
about-
Menard. Were you in Menard, or is
We
that-
didn't make it down this trip. I've been to Menard before, though. I
Right.
mean, it's just as much a hellhole.
Right.
Understand, I mean, we're talking about cells that are 4.5 by 9 feet, about half the size of a small bathroom. We're putting 2 people in there, and we're leaving them in there 22 to 24 hours a day. Often, one or both of them have serious mental illness. Imagine having a cellmate who is a full-blown schizophrenic who's not being treated, locked in a tiny little room 24 hours a day.
Alan Mills,
It's
you know,
incredible.
in the old days, you had the conception that people would go to prison and they would get some education, get some job skills. Then there was a kind of move in this country to, if you go to prison, you're out of luck completely, and we're going to set you up for coming back. Is that still continue today? Are there any positive programs, any educational programs, art programs going on in the prisons today, or is that pretty much a thing of the idealistic past?
It is mostly a thing of the past in Illinois, but the correctional thinking has evolved back to the point where we ought to be helping people. There's a recognition that we're letting people out into the streets and letting them out worse than they came in, and that's a mistake.
Yeah.
So, for example, at Stateville, there's a group of young people who are going in as the volunteers to teach art, to teach literacy, that kind of thing. So some of that is happening, but you can't run an entire system of 49,000 people based on a few volunteers out of Chicago. So is it happening system-wide? Absolutely not. Are a few good things happening? Yes, they are. Some people in the leadership of the Department of Corrections absolutely understand that the only way to make the system survive is, first of all, empty it, but second of all, to actually provide those services and programs that we used to do. But there's no money. There's no money for anything right now.
Alan Mills, the Uptown People's Law Office.
Law Center.
Law Center, sorry. I do that. I mix the two together regularly.
So does everybody else.
I know. You guys have been in operation now how long?
We were informally founded in 1975 and formally incorporated in 1978.
Wow. So you're coming up on 40 years.
Yes, we are. And we've been fighting. And, you know, we talk about the criminalization of the homeless, but this is not a new problem. This has been going on in Uptown ever since I've been there. And I know since Michael was there, it was the same problem back in the earlier days as well.
Yeah.
This is not new.
Any cross burnings recently?
We haven't had a cross burning in Uptown recently.
But that was happening as late as the 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that there's not racists still active in Uptown. They just haven't actually been burning crosses. That would probably bring down the property values as well, so they don't do that anymore.
So as you did this tour, you were very active in social media, but I'm curious, as you went into these smaller markets, did you try to do any media to bring attention to what you were discovering? And if so, what was the reaction in those local markets?
We've done some. We've gotten actually very good coverage from the Pantograph downstate. They've spent a lot of time with mentally ill people out of Bloomington. Some of the other local markets have. It's a great newspaper, and they've really dedicated some time, and they've got one investigative reporter who's doing better investigative reporting than anybody at the Tribune is doing on this issue. Yeah, I mean, we're getting some play downstate. The question downstate is always jobs. Because we've so decimated the economy down there, in many towns, the only jobs available are in the prison system.
Or fracking?
Or fracking. Right. Well, fracking doesn't generate a whole lot of jobs.
No.
It generates a lot of money, but very few jobs.
And polluted water.
Well, yeah, if you want to drink your water, definitely you shouldn't do fracking. But, you know, economic development over drinking water, that makes sense to me. So there are definitely pockets of extreme resistance in some of these communities. But even there, I mean, frankly, a decent mental health system would make jobs, would first of all create jobs because you got to hire new people to actually provide those services, and it would make the guards' jobs easier. Dealing with a severely mentally ill person who is not medicated and not being treated is not an easy job. And if you're not trained to deal with the mentally ill, which of course guards are not, then it's an impossible job. So you end up ratcheting up security, you end up ratcheting up violence, you end up punishing people who really just need treatment.
One of the things
It's
that
like the saddest story I can think of, really.
And it's
And-
even
and-
sadder seeing it in person, believe me. It's
reckon.
the most traumatic week I have ever spent in my life.
And yet there seems to be growing attention to the mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, more than I've ever seen in my lifetime, and fairly recently, all the way up to the White House.
Right, and I think that has to do with people like me and other activists who have been repeatedly telling these stories outside, and that's why I'm here. I went through this, but it wasn't just for my own entertainment. I think that those of us who do have access to prisoners and prisons have an absolute obligation to tell that story to as many people as we can
Right.
to continue driving that conversation.
Alan, back in the day, the prison reform movement and the whole question of prisons was really part of the movement, particularly when you had a number of Latino, black, some white people being locked up in prison a lot.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering today, what are the remnants of that? What are those some political activists who are working on prisons? And in the state of Illinois, what groups exist? I mean, I know that there are people out there who brought some changes to Pelican Bay up in California. What's happening here? Are there specific groups, organizations that people should know about?
It's growing. Trinity Church on the south side has Next, an operation going on, trying exactly to build that kind of movement out of Trinity Church. There's some groups on the west side that are very much working on this, including some led by former prisoners. So things are happening, but it's not like it was in the old days. There's just not that big movement. I think that what has to happen is better connections between all of the groups that are recognizing the criminalization of young people on the outside have to connect with the people that are dealing with those same people inside. Because, of course, criminalization of poor people doesn't stop at the prison door. It continues inside. And it's really the same fight. So BYP 100, We Charge Genocide, that's all their fight, and those bridges are beginning to be built.
Yeah, and Project Nia with
Right.
Mariam Kaba, who's also been on this show. I mean, one of the successes recently was the decision in favor of prisoners and their families lower phone
Yeah.
rates. Was that in California?
It was
or-
no, that's
was that
nationally. That was the
nationally?
FCC. Finally,
Yeah,
after
thank
20
God.
years, decided
Well-
to step in and regulate this so that families are no longer, it's really a tax.
It's incredible.
That families are required to pay $20 for 15 minutes phone call.
Right.
That's not for the phone call. That's to support the prison system.
Right.
It's a tax on poor people to pay for their loved ones being locked up. It's the most regressive tax in the entire country.
Indeed. I was glad to hear that decision.
Right.
Alan Mills, thanks for coming and sharing some of your thoughts from your recent tour. It's not a tour most of us would take on willingly, but your work is so important. If nothing else, we have an economic driver in this budget crisis time where we ought to be looking at a better way to spend that money. than the way we
Absolutely.
spend
Get
it
people
now.
out of prison. That's the bottom line.
Get people out of prison. Thank you, Alan Mills, for all your good work. Thanks for all you do.
Thanks for having me.
You are listening to Live from the Heartland show, brought